With UFC 252 in the books, we have a man on the line right now that is the perfect candidate to break down this crazy trilogy ending between Stipe Miocic and Daniel Cormier. Good friend of the program and the man behind the amazing work that the Mac Life has been absolutely demolishing over the last couple of years. Oscar Willis, finally, welcome back to Submission Radio. Dude, we really appreciate you taking time straight from the press conference home and in time to be on the post show. What a legend.
No, thank you very much for having me. And to the viewers who didn't immediately click away after seeing this wasn't John Morgan or Luke Thomas, thank you.
Well, they did click away when they saw it was Jim. So I'm pretty sure we've retained more audience than when they saw his face early in the morning.
I'm just amazed you had Jim on the show. I didn't know they had Wi-Fi in prison, but there you go.
Yeah, speaking of prison, how many fines did you get on the way home speeding from the press conference even to be on our show, Oscar?
Well, listen, to have a fine, they have to catch you, and they just can't. In that soccer mum van that I have, I mean, I can get up to speeds of, I don't know, 65. No, it was fine. I think they would be probably more concerned about the passenger seat editing I did on the way back, but it's fine.
So I guess we got to ask you, right? Coming off the main event, Stipe Miocic retaining his belt against Daniel Cormier, second win for Stipe against DC. What did you think of the fight itself? Because leading into this, I think a lot of people, were shocked at how unbelievably lean Stipe looked. He looked like when he debuted in the UFC, I think it was UFC 136. But also, we expected a much more wrestling-heavy approach from Daniel Cormier, given the small octagon. The other question was, can Daniel Cormier do that at his, somewhat advanced age now? What did you think of the fight and Daniel Cormier not really being able to implement his wrestling here?
Yeah, certainly. The leanness of Stipe Miocic looking like a male stripper out there that did get my attention. But it was actually the most striking when they were in the octagon. All this talk about the size of the octagon made me really conscious of how they looked when they first got in there. And I was looking at Stipe. I was like, man, the guy is so lean. I couldn't believe it. Then the first round sort of went how I thought it would go. DC gets a bit of wrestling in there to not amazing success, but just enough to keep the fight at different levels. And then at the very end, he looks like he sort of rocks Stipe a little bit. Stipe sort of nearly goes down and the round ends. And then from there, I got very confused because it was like the fight just went back to the second fight, but almost at a slower pace. DC abandoned the wrestling. There was no more single legs, which he had built up to be this massive tactic. And I thought Stipe made the adjustments, when Dominic Cruz said it on the broadcast, whenever DC went for the old clinch and to hit him with the right hand, he would just grab him and press him against the cage to negate that. So DC couldn't find that success. And I just found it a little bit weird. I to be honest with you, I found myself thinking, man, DC 3 years ago wouldn't be letting himself sit against the cage like this, right? If you think back to his performances against Gustafsson, against Jones, it was the thing about DC was just forward pressure non-stop. No matter what happens, he was walking forwards. And I don't think I've seen him look so passive, than I did tonight. And I think that was an age thing.
Absolutely. I mean, 41 years old on paper, but just what his body's been through. He looked a lot slower and a lot older going into that octagon. And I'm just wondering, Oscar, the eye pokes. Obviously, there was one towards Stipe. He was able to recover. And then there was the one towards DC, which was rather bad, but his eye was already hurt sort of at that point as well. I mean, Marc Goddard didn't really see it, didn't really give him the time to recover. And I guess the big question around it is, do you think it would have made much difference? Let's say if DC had that, extra 5 minutes to take a deep breath and sort of regain some of his composure. Do you think that would have made much of a difference in that last round?
No, I think the fact DC said to Joe Rogan, I can't fucking see, meant that 5 minutes wasn't the issue. It meant something was very wrong with his eye. Amazing for him to continue even with, and it was actually, I think was it at the end of the third he got poked in the eye?
I think so.
Or was it the fourth? I think it was only in the third, because in the fourth, it was pretty clear that right hand was there for Stipe, right? You could see DC like really aggressively turning away from it and clearly having some issues. Realistically, if Marc Goddard had seen it, he's not going to take a point away because he didn't take a point away from DC. And 5 minutes apparently didn't make any difference anyway. In fact, thinking about it out loud, if Marc Goddard had stopped it, had brought a doctor in to pay attention to the eye, maybe the doctor said, this guy can't continue, he can't see out of this eye. So actually, maybe DC got to go 2 more rounds because Marc Goddard missed it. God, I'm smart. But I think it's a cruel twist of it's a bit of irony, a cruel twist of fate that their third fight would be affected by a very nasty eye poke to DC, right? I mean, that's just kind of cruel twist from the gods, if you want to call it that, or maybe say something better because that sounds shit. But it's sort of ironic. But I think there's not a lot that could have gone differently, really, with how it played out.
Well, because I was going to ask, do you think that there are any lingering questions once these 3 fights are in the books? Do you think there are any lingering questions about Stipe versus DC? And I'm not asking whether this fight will happen again, because I'm pretty sure we're never going to see this. But when you look at it, it's like Stipe got eye poked in the second fight, basically got his eye finger fucked by DC nicely, so much so that it led him to surgery. So while it's unfortunate that we see that happen, Stipe was able to turn that fight around and win a fight that he was losing. Unfortunately, Daniel Cormier wasn't able to. And it's not like DC didn't have his moments, right? He hurt Stipe in the first round, where Stipe looked like he was... the only reason why he was standing was because of the cage, kind of collapsed against it. And then he had other moments in the fight. He was landing massive bombs. The pace that he was going at earlier on the fight was, I think, pretty crazy given DC's age. So it's not like, oh, the eye poke was everything. It just seemed like a bit of an unfortunate way to sort of, end things.
It's the asterisks that will keep people talking, right? But realistically, I think, eye poke or not, DC was being held against the cage for minutes at a time. 1 minute, a minute and a half. That's not a good look for DC. He was meant to be the wrestler, right? But you could see he was taking those moments to collect himself and get some breath. Again, as I talked about earlier, that's not a very DC thing to do. He's Mr. Go. So I think eye poke or not. And also look at how you score it. I could see a world where you scored that like 4-0 going into the final round for Stipe. First round for DC, fine, that's fine. But you could easily give 2, 3, and 4 to Stipe. I know that like some people had it 2-2 and Dana had it 2-2, and it could have been 2-2, but it could have also been 3-1. And I think that says more about the flow of the fight than just like he got his eye finger fucked, like a whore on Thanksgiving. I think it's I think the flow of the fight was not going DC's way, regardless of what would happen with the eye pokes.
I mean, regardless of what happened tonight, we were looking at some of the wins the DC has had, and it's incredible. I mean, you go from his time over there at Strikeforce all the way through to the UFC, and you forget about fights like that last-minute one with Anderson Silva at UFC 200. His wins over... guys like Josh Barnett and all sorts of other big wins, becoming a champ. If this is it, and it's all said and done, Oscar... how do you sort of look at this legacy that Daniel Cormier has had and is sort of leaving behind in the UFC?
I mean, Daniel Cormier is one of the best fighters to ever do it. That's a fact. I mean, Daniel Cormier has the unfortunate legacy of being the best at a time when the best of all time were doing it, right? And he had the massive misfortune of doing that twice over. He had the misfortune of competing against John Jones. If John wasn't there, DC would have ruled light heavyweight. I mean, not comfortably, but would have been considered the greatest light heavyweight of all time. If Stipe wasn't there, he'd probably be considered, if he'd beaten some other guy instead of Stipe, the greatest heavyweight of all time. And if you're going to compare it to like legends of the game or legends of combat sports, he's forever going to be the Joe Frazier, remembered for who he fought rather than remembered for himself. And while that's an unfortunate legacy, it's a bigger legacy than most people get. And I think DC will be one of those guys who gets a company job. He's already a commentator, but the UFC will look after DC, and he will. Okay, he may have not ever been considered this moment best of all time in whatever parameters you want to set, but he will fare far better than many, like 99.9% of fighters.
Yeah.
And he should be happy with that.
Yeah, well, I think it's like the long ongoing cliche, right? That there's no such thing as a fairy tale ending in MMA. Usually it's pretty brutal and pretty sad. And if you look at some of the best heavyweights in MMA of all time, UFC or otherwise, like guys like Randy Couture, who left the sport getting his teeth knocked out by Lyoto Machida. That's not a great exit. Fedor Emelianenko, right? Man, he spent so much time in all of our hearts, right? But in those last few fights, and he's still going, it was really tough to watch, man. The Hendo loss, the Bigfoot loss, the Verdum loss, far from a fairy tale ending. Nogueira, another guy on the Mount Rushmore of MMA heavyweights. Dude, what about him getting brutally knocked out in Abu Dhabi in seemingly like a pretty low-stakes fight? For Daniel Cormier to go in here, be competitive with the current champion, the greatest heavyweight in UFC history, whether that's MMA history or not. But in the UFC history, Stipe is the best. He was competitive. Some people had it going 2-2 into that final 5th round. He didn't get the win, and there was the unfortunate eye poke, but, you know, it's not like he got shut out and got knocked out in brutal fashion. And like you mentioned, Oscar, he's got that awesome commentary gig. He's still going to be so busy. He's got a gym that he runs. I think this is one of the better exits from MMA, and I think it almost kind of makes GSP look even more amazing for the way he was able to do it. But it's an anomaly.
I did find it interesting that Dana White, who has taken every opportunity to belittle GSP's achievements, suddenly this week said, actually, no, he did have the best retirement. Is almost like a setup. So when Daniel were going to retire, he went, no, that's not the best retirement. He should fight John Jones. You know, I found that an interesting little Dana Whiteism this week, but that's sort of besides the point. Yeah, listen, look, Rocky lost his last fight in Rocky Balboa, the terrible movie. He lost his last fight.
There were two endings, just to be clear. There was one where he wins and one where he loses. I went with the wrong one, Ross.
Listen, if you're going by canon, he lost the last fight. But listen, like I'm sure he won't feel like this because he is the fierce competitor that we know it, right? But there is something to be said that you're past your best. Your best is behind you. You're never going to get there again, no matter if you train 16 weeks, 8 weeks, 13 weeks, 20 weeks. You are past your best, and you still were, you know, a cunt hair away from beating the world champion. That's so impressive. And
are you doing stats for ESPN, Oscar?
Yeah, what, did Brett not tweet that out? He was talking about it.
Well, I was waiting for John Anik to break down the cunt hair statistics during the main event, but that didn't quite happen.
Chipping away his own moustache hair, trying to compare the two.
Vince Pichel pulling out some mustache hair.
Well, incidentally, too much moustache talk on the broadcast. I don't care about your moustache.
Yeah, I don't know if we were watching the UFC pay-per-view or porno from the 80s. All right, let's quickly talk about John Jones because you mentioned him before. I had a look at one point. He had 31 new tweets.
Yes.
The whole thing was finishing.
Never seen him so active.
I mean, the guy's taking a break from the community duty to jump on Twitter and set his motions in line. People wondering now, I guess, what's next for him? Is he actually going to get this heavyweight title shot or not? Dana White said this is the first time they've heard back from John Jones since trying to contact him. What do you think about John Jones possibly getting the next shot? Do you think that's the next play by the UFC, or is this going to be Francis Ngannou's shot, as Dana White says right now?
Well, listen, I think it probably depends on how serious John is, right? If John is doing... I mean, when was the last time John saw a heavyweight title fight that he didn't feel like being in a few months? That never happened. I mean, you know, for the last 6 years, he's told us he's going to heavyweight. So you kind of have to take that into consideration. Now, obviously, I think this last time with the Ngannou thing and the subsequent fallout with the UFC, I think that was a bit more legitimate than some of the other times. But if I was the UFC, I mean, first of all, if I'm Dana, I don't really want Francis knocking on my door late or night or early in the morning. I'd rather avoid that. So I think Francis has to get the title shot. What are you going to do, make Francis fight Curtis Blades again or Derek Lewis again? It feels like such a big step down and completely unnecessary. With John, the Dominic Reyes fight is there. I think if you did let John show, you know, John just told us he retired and was going to retire for 2 years until people were going to take him more seriously. So let's see John fight again at light heavyweight, show he's back, and then also you have the little side bonus of if you keep John at 205. Say he fights December of this year, you keep him at 205, then Israel Adesanya early 2021 is still a possibility. If John goes up to heavyweight, that fight is probably gone. So why not just keep him in the middle where you can sort of work out the lay of the land? Because to be honest, if they did Francis versus Stipe and Francis won, Francis versus John for the heavyweight title sells more than John versus Stipe. And then if Francis loses to Stipe, then you could do John versus Adesanya and sell more than that. And I'm not saying the UFC would do something just for the money. That's not really in their wheelhouse. But I'm just saying there's something they would consider.
I'm curious whether it changes things for John Jones if he's to face Francis for the belt or Stipe for the belt, because he's always leaned towards Stipe as kind of like, well, Stipe is not a massive heavyweight, and that was even more pronounced today when we saw a much more leaner version of Stipe. And you got to think also, is he going to beef up a little bit for that Ngannou fight to try and match his strength a little bit? But in an ideal world, I almost think you do Stipe and Jones, and then you either get Francis and Jones, or you get Stipe and Francis the rematch, and it kind of makes them bigger. But like you mentioned, it wouldn't really be fair to Francis. I'm just curious what you guys think. Do you think that And somebody brought this up at the post-fight presser, and DC said it himself. He's not fighting for belts. He doesn't really want to be fighting. But with the eye poke and him coming so close, do you think it leaves the door open for him to return at all? And I know DC said that he's completely done with John Jones, but if there was any fresh new wrinkles, it would be John Jones versus DC at heavyweight. If not a title fight, that's the only thing I can see for DC, as a possibility. Do you guys see it in any way?
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, I'd forgot, like, in between, like, all the great questions at the press conference, I'd sort of forgotten about that one. So I'm glad you brought it back up.
You don't want to talk about Stefan Struve?
We've all got our unique.
What's he doing lately? He should fight for the title next. Forget John Jones.
But listen, we need that rematch. Come on, everyone wants to see it. No, we've all got our unique angles. Some good, some not great. But that is an interesting wrinkle. And I will say, when DC lost to John, both times he was emotionally wrecked. When he lost to Stipe the second time, he was clearly just like fucked over it. You could tell that he'd fucked up and stuff. This time, when he was talking to Joe Rogan, I felt he was angry. He was fucking pissed that he swore about it. I could see he was angry. So if there was any bizarre little asterisk that would see Daniel Cormier fight again, I think we saw it tonight. Unless it was a draw or something, I think the fact his eye got messed up was kind of like the only thing that would keep him coming back. So before I said win or lose, he's definitely done. Now I think there is a little bit of a door open. There is a little bit of a window to seeing him fight again. But it depends. I could see Daniel fighting. Stipe's booked against Ngannou or whatever. 10 weeks out, Ngannou falls out injured, and then they give old DC a call. Fuck, it's leaving a bit of the old Moolah, and then I could see him stepping in for the title. As long as it's for a title, I could see DC finding it hard to say no.
And I think one of the things that, sorry, Oscar, go on.
No, I was done. I just rubbed my foot on the floor and it made a noise.
Nice. I was gonna say the thing with DC that we haven't mentioned as well, part of his legacy is he's great at building up fights, but in a way where he's kind of a great mentor and a great sort of person to represent the sport, but still does it in a way where there's a bit of trash talk and a bit of heat there and stuff. So he's really great at that build up. In a lot of ways, he's kind of like a more respectful Michael Bisping going into a fight. But
now they both have.
DC...
That's sad.
Well, I was going to say the thing with DC is it kind of reminds me.
By the way, we don't actually know the state of DC's eye yet, so I really fucking hope that's not true.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. No, but I was going to say, and so I feel like you might feel this reference as well a little bit, Oscar, is, Muhammad Ali, he was going through his career towards the end, it was harder and harder to watch him fight. And today, DC did quite well, but it was noticeable how much slower he was, how many less weapons he had. And it would just hurt me to see him go into the octagon with John Jones, possibly a year or so later, and his body being even probably in worse condition, him being in worse shape, and not resembling that fighter that we remembered all those years ago.
That's a good point.
I'd hope he goes into retirement, because MMA is a cruel mistress and he has so many options. But let's just quickly talk about a young guy dealing with injuries. I mean, here we are, we're talking about DC. He's 41 and he's still going and he's still put on a good performance. And here we have Sean O'Malley, the Sugar Show, coming out. Everybody was so excited for this co-main event. And Oscar, we see him re-injuring his leg. He's mentioned that it was a similar injury to what he had in the past. What was your reaction to this going down as the whole world was sort of watching the Sugar Show? And it felt like if he was going to get the win here, it was going to take him up to that next tier of superstar.
Yeah, as much as everyone's sick and tired of the comparisons, I'm going to be lazy and make one myself. I feel like this was almost his Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier fight, right? It was almost like the level where it's like, is this guy as legit as we think he is? Is he a game changer? Or how's he going to perform? And it was just super unfortunate, And then it raises more questions, right? Like, okay, is he going to be another Dominic Cruz now, where he's just injury prone and every fight he's like a glass cannon, he could just get tagged and he falls apart? It raises a lot of questions. Hopefully the injury's not so severe, because he had so much momentum going into this. He was getting it, he was carving his own little niche. And I mean, if you could script like one of the worst ways for this fight to go, I think him re-injuring that would be up there. Just a shame, man. There's not really a lot to say because not a whole lot happened. I think they're still sort of going through the feel out process, and I don't know. The UFC brought someone back that I had to ask some questions to, so I didn't really get to watch it, which I'm fine about. I'm not bitter about it at all. I don't care. But yeah, I mean, it's just unfortunate, right? I mean, who wants to see that? If he's going to lose, you'd rather him lose decisively, give Vera the rub that he deserves from winning, as opposed to this weird sort of middle part where like, oh, well, he didn't really win, so no one's going to click on the video and give me views. And then, you know, he didn't really lose, but he's injured, and do we care about him anymore or not? You know, it's a weird sort of hybrid place.
Well, the fight looked drastically different from the moment he got injured to the moment it ended. It wasn't like...
It's like he didn't walk.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like when he fell on the ground, it wasn't like, oh, he ate some massive shot or a massive kick. He fell because he stumbled, and I believe it's a Lisfranc fracture, which how unlucky do you have to be, right? Like if it was, say, the other knee or the other leg or something completely random, it's a different story. But for the same injury to keep popping up, and after the time he spent away with that injury, with all the USADA controversies, etc., it just grinds everything to a halt. And to make Conor McGregor comparisons, I almost feel like this was his Max Holloway fight, where Conor had the ACL, kept going, was able to pull out the win, which looking back on is just remarkable. Unfortunately, Sean, and not taking anything away from him, but he was unable to do it. So he kind of, from the casual fan's perspective, there's kind of that excuse there where it's like, well, you know, he didn't get really beaten. It was his own injury. So that's, I guess, good in a sense. If you're going to take a loss, that's a good way to take a loss. But as far as grinding his momentum to a halt when he had so much of it, what a shit show.
Well, not just that, like you could feel the hype machine sort of loading both barrels behind him, right? It was almost like they had it charged up for this fight, and if he won, you could feel he was just going to explode all over the fan spaces. And the fact that they didn't, you know, it's like there's a lot of celebrities they included in it. You could just feel they wanted to hype up the O'Malley show. They made him co-main event to the biggest heavyweight fight in their history, essentially. So it's just doubly disappointing because, you know, the casual audience they're going to see that, and they're just going to sort of think, half of them will think it was an unfortunate incident, and the rest of them are going to think, oh, this guy's worthless, you know, he falls apart at any moment. I just don't think it did anyone any favors. And that's, if you're the UFC, whatever fight you book, realistically, you might have a preference to the outcome in certain ones, but realistically, you want each fight to just do one of them some good, regardless of the outcome. If you can't control the outcome, just make sure one of them comes off slightly better off than they were before. And I don't think this fight really does that. I don't think Vera gets the rub at all, because everyone's going to be like, well, his fucking foot fucking fell apart. So I just think I just don't know. It's sort of a non-starter, right? It's like the fight just almost didn't happen. It just kind of fell apart.
Well, I'll tell you what, it was an interesting night in the office for one Oscar Willis. And Oscar, as we wrap up, just want to quickly mention again to everybody out there, the Fighters Only MMA Awards. You guys are nominated, the Mac Life and Oscar's amazing work. And we implore everybody to jump on and make sure they vote for our guy, Oscar. He's done an amazing job, not just because he's a friend of...
Mission Radio.
That's right.
Ooh.
Win for the little guy. That's right. So that's the real election people should be focusing on. I feel like CNN should be reporting on it. But anyway, let's not get into it because his name is Oscar Willis. You can follow him at Oscar Willis on Twitter and Instagram. Of course, themaclife.com, your place for all the coverage of every event that you need to find out. And of course, Oscar, we appreciate and are excited to have you back on Submission Radio, man. Thank you so much for hustling and getting onto the program. It's been a real pleasure for us.
Thank you so much. Free Jim Edwards.